Sehr geehrte Hörerinnen und Hörer auf dem Freien Radio Berlin-Brandenburg, Sie sind jetzt Zeuge einer Sondersendung, einer Live-Übertragung der Lesung Murder Incorporated hier aus Berlin, anlässlich des 39. Haftjahrestags des Radiojournalisten Mumia Abu-Jamal. Welcome everyone to a reading from Murder Incorporated, American and European History from Below, on the subject of 500 years of colonialism, mass murder and white supremacy. My name is Gregor, and I'm with Free Mumia Berlin, who are hosting this evening together with the bookshop Schwarze Risse in Kreuzberg in Berlin. I welcome everyone watching the English and the German version of our YouTube streams, as well as all radio listeners at Free Radio Berlin-Brandenburg, which is broadcasting the German translation live from here tonight on 88.4 FM in Berlin and 90.7 FM in the Potsdam area. Before I introduce the books, the authors, and our reader, Darnell Stephen Summers, I'd like to go into some technical points, since tonight these are somewhat special. Initially, this was planned differently, but due to corona health aspects, we changed the whole sequence of events. Unfortunately, there's no live audience present at the reading, and everyone involved is in a different area, connected via the internet. For those of you on YouTube, you may use the chat to ask questions during the event. Some of us will try their best to answer them in the chat, and we will try to discuss one or two or three of them after the reading if time permits. So let's keep our fingers crossed that we will get everything right and can solve all technical hiccups so that you can enjoy the event and get a good impression of Mumia Abu-Jamal's and Stephen Vittoria's three-volume work, Murder Incorporated. Murder Incorporated is a book series. 2 volumes were published by Prison Radio in 2018 and 2019, while just a few days ago, Volume 3 came off the press and is now available via Prison Radio. At the end of this program, we will give you the internet link to enable you to get your copy. Murder Incorporated was written by 2 authors. First, Stephen Vittoria, who is a filmmaker from New Jersey. You may have seen his 2012 documentary, Long Distance Revolutionary, on the life of the revolutionary journalist Mumia Abu-Jamal, which screened in cinemas across the US and throughout Germany as well. Well, Mumia Abu-Jamal, who is the topic of that film, is the second author of this book. He is now 66 years old and has spent most of his life in prison. In 1982, Mumia was railroaded in an internationally condemned show trial. The railroad was organized by a right-wing judge and a district attorney whose main goal was to get convictions and death sentences, but mostly by a police department that was and is internationally known for its corruption and brutality. At the time, it was so violent and crooked that 2 years before Mumia's arrest in 1979, it was investigated by the US Department of Justice, whose report came to the conclusion that the behavior of the Philadelphia Police Department, quote unquote, shocks the conscience. Mumia was a Black Panther in his youth, and in the late 1960s, he became the media spokesperson of the Panthers in Philadelphia. Later on, he went into radio journalism, and before his arrest, he was a renowned voice on different radio stations throughout the state of Pennsylvania and the US, including NPR. He received several awards and was the chairman of the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists. Part of the reason he was so well received was that he gave voice to the voiceless in his reporting, choosing perspectives usually not followed by radio journalism. He was fiercely critical of the police whenever they killed people in the streets, something that at the time happened very frequently in Philadelphia and continues to happen to this very day. He investigated corruption in the public services, which mostly harmed the poor sections of society, and he allowed victims to present their own views on the radio. He ruined the career of a judge and challenged Philadelphia's Mayor Frank Rizzo, a former cop and police commissioner who was well known in the black community of the city for his racism and his support of police brutality. On December 9, 1981, that's 39 years ago to this day, the police arrested Mumia and falsely accused him of the murder of a Philly police officer named Daniel Faulkner. Although Mumia was almost fatally shot in the chest by this cop when he approached the scene, and plenty of evidence indicates that someone else shot the cop in reaction to this, the arriving police decided to pin the death of the officer on Mumia. His trial in 1982 was controversial from the day it started. In 2000, Amnesty International published a report which stated that the proceedings, quote unquote, did not meet international standards safeguarding a fair trial, end of quote. Well, that puts it very, very mildly. In Mumia's trial, we saw all the things which plague the US judicial system in its treatment of people of color and poor whites until today. Racial and class bias in jury selection on part of the prosecutor, the withholding of exculpatory evidence by both the police and the DA, the introduction of fabricated and false evidence, and the repression of witnesses favorable to the defense. Moreover, Mumia was excluded from his own trial for most of the time because he dared to protest against these measures. All of this was orchestrated by or with the help of a judge who, in the course of his career, sentenced more people to death than any other judge in the United States. In 1982, Mumia was sentenced to death as well, and by now, whole generations of people all over the world have fought against his execution and demanded his freedom. The case of Mumia Abu-Jamal is probably one of the world's most debated cases of state repression and politically motivated despotism. As Mumia is by no means the only one in the US suffering this treatment, he resumed his journalism in prison and started to give a voice to the millions of prisoners in today's United States. He was one of the early analysts who helped the general public to understand the mechanisms of the prison industrial complex and of mass incarceration, the modern version of slavery in the United States. He's a vigorous opponent of the death penalty, which is nothing more than the replacement of the lynch mobs of the 19th and first half of the 20th century by the cold, meticulously organized violence of the state. But well beyond that, his commentaries, first from Death Row and now from Prison Nation, cover an enormous range of topics ranging from US domestic and international politics to racist murders, for instance here in Germany, as we all remember his commentaries on the case of Uri Jalloh. In 2011, his death sentence was thrown out by the US Supreme Court, which finally recognized at least one of the many constitutional violations that had happened in Mumia's trial. He was released from solitary confinement on death row into a less harsh prison system, only to become seriously ill with hepatitis C in 2015, which almost led to his death. It took almost 2 years and a massive international support to win a court decision that ordered his treatment and saved his life in 2017. That court decision meant that thousands of other prisoners with the same condition now also have the right to get that new and life-saving treatment for hepatitis C. After important court decisions affecting his appeals rights in 2016, 18, and 19, Mumia's case is again moving, and there's a real chance for him to gain his freedom in the near future. I will give you some information on this after the reading with Stephen Summers, who will start reading from Murder Incorporated in a minute. Darnell Stephen Summers is a contemporary of Mumia. In his youth, he was forced to join the US Army because of the draft and was sent to Vietnam. He saw the atrocities and war crimes of his government against the Vietnamese people with his own eyes and experienced the horrors of war. He has never stopped to fight for peace ever since. Stephen also has his own story of political persecution. In 1968, he was charged with the murder of a policeman due to a witness statement coerced by the police, which was later thrown out by courts not only once, but twice. One time, in 1982, even the German government was complicit in this when they arrested him and then, it was then formerly West Berlin, extradited him to the United States. Although the event in question happened 52 years ago, only a month ago, the Michigan State Police harassed him again while he was visiting his old hometown, Detroit, triggering a massive show of solidarity by many people in Detroit and elsewhere. Through the hashtag #KeepDarnell Free, The US media outlets were unable to pick up on this insane behavior on the part of the police, and many of them did. Fortunately, Darnell Stephen Summers is with us today and will start his reading right now. Stephen, over to you.
Murder Incorporated, Book 1, Acknowledgements. Who births a book? Who gives it blood, sinews, limbs, brain? Ben Yochanan, Ivan Van Sertima, Herbert Aptica, C.L.R. James, George Nass, Ishika Musa Barashango, Runako Rashida, Ward Churchill, and Du Bois, and many others. Often the works of these historians were emblazoned with the deftly drawn dark figures in majestic poses, speaking to us across eons, saying softly, almost imperceptibly, I'm here, I'm here. Many, if not most of these historians were, a term few would use themselves, outlaw historians, rebels who turned their backs on the guild, for their work was so disruptive of the accepted canon. They searched and unearthed canons from antiquity that preceded the works of Europe by centuries. For example, who knows the phrase black is beautiful, so evocative of the proverbial 60s, was echoed in spirit more than 1,000 years before that era. As a man of that era, really a teen, I thought we were breaking new ground, speaking thoughts that bubbled in our breast for the first time. Well, Dr. Ben, as Yohanan was affectionately known by his students, certainly knew, for in many of his typewritten texts he cited al-Jahizi's Book of the Glory of the Black Race, written by a black Arab of Basra, Iraq, decades after Islam's founding. This work, written between 1776 and 776 and 868 AD, reads as if it were written at the height of the Black Power movement circa 1968. These writers dared to break new ground, only to learn new things, but to unlearn uncanonical verities that were as traditional as they were misleading. Of course, this work is inspired by the remarkable Howard Zinn, who, burned by the savagery of the World War II and inspired by the true courage of civil rights activists, many of whom were his students, like the acclaimed novelist Alice Walker, learned not from the classics, but from his students, among them men and women who marched on the front lines of history. This work is dedicated to all of them, who, by their works, made this one possible. Mumia Abu-Jamal. Chapter 3. There is a plague loose upon the land. Drift back in time. More than 500 years to a tropical landmass. A gentle breeze envelops every inch of your naked body as you stand on an unspoiled beach. You drop softly to your knees. Now bend forward Get very close to the sand. Close enough you can't glimpse anything else. Cup some of the powder white sand in your hand. Catch the sun ricocheting off the granular matter now slipping through your fingers. In this area known now as the Caribbean, the sand is usually a mix of two distinct types of rock and minerals. The broken down skeletal remains of dead corals in a darker variety, black or brown detrital sand, which is a natural result of the island's rock eroding through the ages. It feels perfect between your fingers because it is. Close your eyes and focus on the sound of the tide quietly brushing up against the coastline just a few yards away. This ebb and flow is also perfection. Perfection has been washing over this coast for millennia. This sea, the Caribbean Sea, is one of the largest saltwater seas on the planet. But you know that because you can taste the sodium and chloride ions as they jump in. And that's when you realize that the water is unusually warm for ocean water, rendered that way by its tropical location and the influence of the Gulf Stream. Look down. The water is incredibly clear because there's very little plankton or suspended particles in the tropics. And, as you can notice, the color varies. Some of the sea appears dark and deep blue, and that's because the sunlight is scattered by the water molecules. Other sections of the sea are lighter in color. The predominant aqua color you see indicates shallow water because that's where the sunlight reflects off the land and leaves the aqua surface. Now, you're lucky to have a most moderate resolution imaging spectroradiography. The image taken from spaceman Victor sea level giant moments flash by in 5% black and white. You face the beachhead that leads to a gray and winter rock formation, small cliff that appears to be the foundation for a more abundantly green and flourishing subtropical landscape, thriving with red royal, coconut palms, mahogany, cedar, wide-arched musgrave, and a smattering of red, white, and mangroves. Right down what you call these areas. Now you find vision. You find fast over the treetops the island's higher regions where you encounter mountain forests dense with palms, creative ferns, and probably 1,000 different species of orchid. Glide to your left, where in stark contrast you're heading toward an arid landscape dotted with cacti, bending every which way but loose. As you descend over a dry rock basin, you spot a rhinoceros iguana sunning herself between a small cactus and some thorny bushes. Birds indigenous to this Caribbean island dart and glide around you: a parakeet, a rare trogon, a woodpecker, a white-necked crow, and then finally a green-tailed warbler. Now you bank to the right and ascend slightly over a line of coconut palm trees that reveal a village where in the middle of what you thought was an uninhabited Shangri-La, you see small circular structures that you recognize as homes, where the construction is simple but strong. Long poles support woven straw and palm leaves, green construction before it was chic to care. Some people leave their homes and you notice that, like you, these men, women, and children are naked or close to naked. You notice that some of these people are adorned with paint and shells, and the colors, even from up here, are extraordinary. More people gather in the center of the village, where you gently hover above a lively festival of the Taino people, historic relatives of the Arawak people who hail from Central and South America. Your first instinct is correct. These are peaceful people living in accord with the natural world, with each other. And if you could spend one day in their community, you would quickly realize that this is a population that lacks guile. Just as Bartolomé de las Casas, when you see him, one of the great historic whistleblowers, the Ellsberg of his day, And maybe, just maybe, the spirit of this 16th century Spanish historian, social reformer, and slavery abolitionist was coursing through the veins of the 20th century English musician John Lennon when he wrote his Anthem of Hope. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No greed, no need for greed or hunger, a brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. It's the perfect soundtrack to transition back to the beach, back to the sparkling sand, possibly the exact spot where the invaders would plant their poisonous flag. And when they planted this flag, they planted it with great hubris, claiming possession of the so-called New World, two massive continents inhabited far and near by countless millions for more than 20,000 years. By now you realize where you are, the island of Hispaniola, in the last days of 1492. You spent your entire life listening to and reading safe and guild historians concoct a mythical cover story for what this so-called New World, one that depicts the Americas as a virgin land, basically uninhabited except for the pockets of savages who were quickly demonized as subhuman, obviously inferior, and marked for removal. Instinctually, you know all too well this means extermination, and it sickens you. Like most of cover stories throughout human political history, the lie is more effective if it is a gigantic lie. And this lie was Goliath. And once a lie is securely in place, you recognize that the rest is easy because the inferior savage has no rights to life, liberty, or the land they have inhabited for thousands and thousands of years. Now turn around toward the water. Look closely at the horizon. You'll see a dark cloud rising. At first you might surmise that it's a storm front gathering to the east with its distant rolling thunder shaking the earth. But it's not. It's rising too fast and rumbling too hard for any weather pattern this planet has ever seen. Hell, this thing dwarfs the sweeping and surging power of a tsunami. It's clear that this beast even chases the sun. So here you stand on this pristine beach in the waning days of the 15th century, witnessing the beginning of the end for a civilization that stretches from what now is the northern shores of Alaska and Canada to the southern tip of South America. It was remarkable civilization with bustling population centers, teeming with merchants, artists, musicians, farmers, men, women, and children. The reality of the Aztec civilization in Mexico is a perfect antidote to the convenient lie generated by Western conquerors and their myth makers that the Americas, this new world, was a vast uninhabited landmass barely populated by nomadic savages in need of taming or eradication. Behold, paradise found. That's what Hernan Cortes thought when he and his Spanish army brazenly ambled into central Mexico, where an estimated population of 25 million inhabitants lived in and around the Valley of Mexico and its centerpiece, the Lake of the Moon. The people built their cities and towns on and around this interconnected waterway. They built dams and dikes. They built up a central metropolis on the lake as vast as Manhattan. This Aztec capital boasted a population many times that of London or other European cities of the day. Cortes stood on the edge of the thriving archipelago. His companion and chronicler, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, gazed out over the same iridescent beauty and later remembered. I stood looking at it and thought never in the world will there be discovered lands such as these. In fact, that's what you're thinking as you stand there naked on this pristine beach where a massive beating is about to be unleashed on these unsuspecting and guileless people. One that starts in the Caribbean as slaughter, butchery, and carnage, and then expands throughout the Americas as genocide, Holocaust, a final solution. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and give a warm welcome to the fury zeroing in on the idyllic Caribbean, the imminent dawn of the American empire. In the prologue to his remarkable work, American Holocaust, Professor and author David Stannard draws a historical thread from 1492 right into the heart of the American century. Quote, in the darkness of an early July morning in 1945, on a desolate spot in the New Mexico desert, named after John Donne sonnet celebrating the Holy Trinity, the first atomic bomb was exploded. J. Robert Oppenheimer later remembered that immense flash of light, followed by the thunderous roar, caused a few observers to laugh and others to cry. But most, he said, were silent. Oppenheimer himself recalled that an instant, a line from the Bhagavad Gita, I am death, I have become death, the shatterer of worlds. There's no reason to think that anyone aboard the Nina, the Pinta, or the Santa Maria on an equally dark early morning 4.5 centuries earlier thought of those ominous lines from the ancient Sanskrit poem when the crew of the Spanish ship spied a flicker of light on the windward side of the island that they would name after the Holy Savior. But the intuition, had it occurred, would have been as appropriate then as it was when the first nuclear blast rocked the New Mexico desert sands. In both instances, at the Trinity test site in 1945 and at San Salvador in 1492, those moments of achievement crowned years of intense personal struggle and adventure for their protagonists were culminating points of ingenious technological achievement for their countries. But both instances also were prelude to orgies of human destructiveness that, each in its own way, attained a scale of devastation not previously witnessed in the entire history of the world. Just 21 days after the first atomic test in the desert, the Japanese industrial city of Hiroshima was leveled by a nuclear blast. Never before had so many people, at least 130,000, probably many more, died from a single explosion. Just 21 years after the Columbus's first landing in the Caribbean, the vastly populated island that the explorer renamed Hispaniola was effectively desolate. Nearly 8 million people, those Columbus chose to call Indians, had been killed by violence, disease, and despair. It took a little longer, about the span of a single human generation, but what happened on Hispaniola was the equivalent of more than 50 Hiroshimas. And Hispaniola was only the beginning. Chapter 4. The murderers of the New World arrive in the Americas. Quote, there is no more glaring distortion in the history learned by the generations of Americans in textbooks, in schools, in popular culture than in the story of Christopher Columbus, Howard Zinn. They came from feverish, fetid cities and sewers of repressive Spain, driven by dreams of avarice. Poor, young, maddened as hatters they were, for their homes, their villages, and the rapidly vacated prison cells held no promise. Their cohorts to the west would later leave the crowded, loud, vaporous, and unjust realm of the British princes with mirages of money, gold, land, wealth swimming in their diseased redness. They left the cold, clammy, rainy shores of home to enter what must have seemed paradise, the balmy, sunlit shores of Turtle Island. They, each and all, met beings of rare and unblemished beauty, sun-kissed men, women, and children, living virtual gardens of a kind of Eden, resplendent with health, vitality, and love of their lands, their gods, their cities, and even those storm-tossed tossed, haggard, smelly, fish-colored strangers. For though they spoke in strange tongues and wore rough, ragged, stinking tunics and had medals they had never seen before, were they not people? Were they not also human? What does one do when he sees people in hunger and distress, ill and perhaps a bit mad? What's the worst that could happen? People help, yes, even strangers with thick tongues speaking gibberish. This, peoples of the lands that would one day call the Americans did. They tended wounds, they fed the hungry, they taught the stupid fellow beings how to farm, how to listen to the land that is the mother of us all. How could they know that this was the worst thing they could do? How could they know that this sick, feverish people would repay their kindness with genocide? How could they know that these blue-eyed God-men, greedy people, would turn on the hands that fed them? And not just bite them, but slice them from their attached sinews and bone, bind them in chains, rape their daughters and mothers, corrupt their sons, burn their villages to ash, and wipe them from the faith of the mother, wipe them from existence. From these sailors, these shipmates, these explorers, would come a holocaust of epic and ungodly proportion. For the peoples of Turtle Island, the Aztec, the Maya, and the million other clans and bands and tribes had nurtured a ravenous beast which would leap at their throats, destroy their lives and dreams, and wreak unholy havoc and terror on the world under the guise of liberty. The world would be transformed by the loving kindness of the people we have come to call Indians. For in welcoming these foreign peoples into their homes, they opened the door to almost total destruction. This story, the end of their world, marked the emergence in the brief span of 5 centuries of the most ruthless and voracious empires this world, this earth has ever seen. Why should you destroy us? It would be nice to think that things could have evolved differently in the Americas. Some historians blissfully write a kind of hope history, as if, what if Columbus did this, or what if Da Gama did that? These are mere mind games, word plays of wasted time, for things happen as they did because, regrettably, the forces launching those ships across surging seas were powerful and deep. For, truth be told, neither Spain, England, France, nor Holland were nice places. For the simple fact that much of Europe was a cesspool of disease, of class, of religious conflict, of social and official violence, that is to say, it was a place ripe for leaving. When written accounts were published about a land of honey, of endless spring, of sweet flowing waters, imagine the psychological forces drawing on such people to this new, fresh, clean land. Oppressed at home and under a rapacious nobility, threatened with the sulfurous fires of hell by a venal, sacerdotal class hungry for indulgences, the seaward route to this new Eden must have seemed like a great escape. Millions of Europeans would be drawn into the new Europe, a place where every dream could be made reality, if only those pesky Indians weren't in the way. This is not to suggest that the Southern Europeans had an identical view as their Western colleagues, for the Spanish saw these teeming lands as a place rich in slaves, while their brethren English wanted land with the natives preferably gone. Whether united in view and action was a ruthless extermination of Indians by hook or starvation, and if all else failed, by Christianity. When the Spanish hit the Indies, they burned through those societies like a hurricane of fire, while villages perished by the lethality of disease they imported. Citizens once vibrant with life, commerce, culture, became charnel houses of bone. When the Spanish encountered indigenous people, they chained them, recited the cruel requerimiento to people who hadn't the faintest notion of what they were saying or even its intent, and enslaving them, sent them into the mines for gold and silver. The document to read to them had the following message, quote, I certify to you that, with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command. And we shall take your goods and shall do all the mischief and damage that we can, as vassals do not obey and refuse to receive the Lord and resist and contradict him. End of quote. On Sunday, October 1492, Cristobal Colon, a.k.a. Christopher Columbus, wrote in his diaries, El Diario de Cristobal Colon, the following passage that clearly underscores the burgeoning European motives of hegemony and conquest. From the outset, slavery was also in the air. Columbus' observance in an obvious harbinger of the transatlantic slave trade lurking on the horizon, after the obligatory salutation, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, Cristobal Colon speaks from the heart. The people here are simple in warlike matters, as your highnesses will see by those 7 which I have ordered to be taken and carried to Spain in order to learn our language and return, unless your highnesses should choose to have them all transported to Castile or held captive in the island. I could conquer the whole of them with 50 men and govern them as I please. The Spaniards wanted the natives alive, if only to work for them as gold slaves. The English wanted their land, period. They had little use for living natives. And yet, even this is a bit of exaggeration. For historian David Stannard informs us, numbers of people left dead in the wake of the Spanish gold hunger is, to say the least, staggering. This brief paragraph should more than suffice. By the time the 16th century had ended, perhaps 200,000 Spaniards had moved their lives to the Indies, to Mexico, to Central America, and points further to the south. In contrast, by that time, somewhere between 60 million and 80 million natives from those lands were dead. Even then, the carnage was not over. Somewhere between 60 million and 80 million natives dead, extinguished, slaughtered, liquidated. That's how the Americas came to be. They are the bones upon which this beast was fed and raised. This was the Europeans' response to those who succored their sick and starving, wet and cold voyagers from the sea. Many Americans are aware of the name Pocahontas, a recognizable, if only because the name was used in a popular Disney film which tells the story of a beautiful Indian maiden who saves the life of a white guy. There is, in fact, a basis to this tale, but as in most American Disney-fied history, much is left out. There was a maiden named Pocahontas, and she did save the life of John Smith. What American history books usually exclude is the reply given by her father, Wahun Sonekak, circa 1547 to 1619, known as to the whites as Powhatan, when Smith threatened him about a year later after his life was spared. The father of Pocahontas responded to Smith's threat thus: "Why should you take by force from us which you can have by love? Why should you destroy us who provided you with food? What can you get by war? We can hide your provisions and fly into the woods, and then you must consequently famish by wrongdoing, by wronging your friends. What is the cause of your jealousy? You see us unarmed and willing to supply your wants. If you come into a friendly manner and not with swords and guns, as to invade an enemy, I am not so simple as to not know it is better to eat good meat, lie well, sleep quietly with my woman and children, to laugh and be merry with the English, being their friend, to have copper, hatchets, and whatever else I want, then fly from all, to lie cold in the woods, feed upon acorns, roots, and such trash, and to be so hunted that I cannot rest, eat, or sleep. In such circumstances, my men must watch, and if a twig should but break, all would cry out, "Here comes Captain Smith." And so, in this miserable manner, to end my miserable life, therefore, exhort you to peaceable counsels, and above all, I insist that the guns and swords, the cause of all our jealousy and uneasiness, be removed and sent away. End of quote. And what instead was sent away? The dozens of clans, tribes, and nations of the Powhatan Confederacy, a unified force of more than 30 such peoples, covering hundreds of miles in area. We fed you, the tribes exclaimed in 1,000 or more, or 500,000 tongues. We broke bread with you or smoked the pipe. How could you be so evil toward us? By the time comprehension dawned upon them, it was too late. So many of the people had perished, and too many Europeans were flooding their shores, north and south. Creation of the other. We're all tempted to make assumptions based upon our own experiences, biases, and worldviews. History decrees do not wipe these factors from consciousness. We looked at the vast, almost incomprehensible carnage and asked, how can this be? How can human beings do these kinds of things to other human beings? The uncomfortable answer is that humans learn by rote, by observations, and by doing. Before the deed is the thought, and in the realm of the mind, the other, as in other human, is created, embellished, ostracized from the notion of normality. The Spain that launched the monstrous Recubrimiento, is it coincidence that that very year, marking the transatlantic voyage of the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, marks only the culmination of the Reconquista, the reconquest, and the expulsion of both Jews and Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula? Jews posed a particular problem in the European Christian communities, for they are intrinsically the seed stock from Christ, and thus Christianity was born. But their stubborn refusal to adopt the central tenet of the divinity of Christ marks them as enemies of the faith. And although Jews were expelled from several European nations in the Middle Ages, France, England, etc., royal, church, and communal pressure, i.e. social terrorism against Jewish communities, and in Spain forced many Jews to convert to Christianity. Even these people, called conversos, were ever suspect, deemed converts, and thus subject to intense scrutiny and, when appropriate, public violence. After forcing them and Muslims to wear a designation on their clothes, identifying their faith, Christians embarked upon public attacks that burned, flayed, and slaughtered them, the others. Standard recounts that their expulsion on a date of particular renown. On the very day that Columbus set forth on his journey that would shake the world, the port city he sailed from was filled with ships that were deporting Jews from Spain. By the time the expulsion was complete, between 120,000 and 150,000 Jews had been driven from their homes, their valuables, often meager, having first been confiscated, and then they were cast out to sea. As one contemporary described the scene, quote, "It was pitiful to see their suffering. Many were consumed by hunger, especially nursing mothers and their babies. Half-dead mothers held dying children in their arms. I can hardly say how cruelly and greedily they were treated by those who transported them. Many were drowned by the avarice of the sailors, and those who were unable to pay their passage sold their children. End of quote. These events dovetailed with the voyage of Columbus. That is to say, the tormentors of the expelled Jews were the same kind of men who would inflict immense and unimaginable cruelties on the Mayans, the Aztecs, and millions of other peoples. They learned it at home. In the minds of the Spaniards, were these people not like the Jews, others? Were they not the anathema to the Mother Church? Among the English, a similar historical legacy was being made, for the British antipathy to the Jews was perhaps equal to the Spanish. But another group became the proving ground for their colonist, expansionist, and imperialist practices. In England, the Irish served the function of exempling the other. Stannard explains, quote, Britain's peoples considered themselves the most civilized on the earth, and before long they would nod approvingly at Oliver Cromwell, declared God to be an Englishman. It is not surprising then that English tracts and official minutes during this time described the wild Irish as naked rogues in the woods and bogs whose ordinary food is some kind of grass. Less ordinary food for the Irish. Some reported was the flesh of other people, sometimes their own mothers, which perhaps was only fair, since still other tall stories had it that Irish mothers ate their children. The Irish were in some unreasonable beast, said William Thomas. Beasts that live without any knowledge of God or of good manners, in common of their goods, cattle, women, children, and every other thing. Such brutishness was beyond the English capacity for tolerance, especially when the vulgarians in question occupied such lovely land. So, as they had for centuries, the English waged war to pacify and civilize the Irish. This demonization of the Irish as the Jews and Muslims of Spain allowed the British aristocracy to justify conquest, exploitation, and finally state terror against them, for they were England's other, the first of many, as history would prove. These internal others were the primers for the graduate level repression abroad, as practiced against the Indians, and shortly thereafter, Africans for centuries. Driven by a malevolent church and the ravenous royal houses of their lands, how can anything at all, surprise us when we witness the sheer madness that visited upon the relatively dark-skinned peoples they met in the world they called new? They were, to the invaders, new. Even those societies had existed for 40,000 years. And they were vulgarians, even though these natives' lives spent in cities of splendor and delight had no peer in the dark, dank, cold places of the invaders' origin. They, in all their various manifestations, lived life in ways unimaginably different and better than these explorers. Their only deficit was in the arts of war and death, and against these they could not compete. The Indians, especially in what would later be called Hispaniola, Cuba, and Central America and Mexico, lived lives that would have been the burning envy of all Europe. When the Spanish invader Hernán Cortés reached the island city of Tenochtitlan, he called it the most beautiful city on earth, roughly the size of modern-day Manhattan. It was a home of 350,000 Aztecs. Cortez's chronicler, Bernal Diaz de Castillo, wrote the cities of the Aztecs were spacious, sweet-smelling, and wonderful to behold. Its buildings were made of stone, with framing and furnishings of fragrant cedar wood, and the inhabitants used canoes to travel to and from this splendid, beautiful island. The Spanish were so dazed by what they saw that they imagined that they were in a dream. But before they left, they transformed it into a living hell, a nightmare that may have begun in 1492, but one that did not end there. Truth be told, the lives of the Aboriginal peoples of the Americas remained hellish for centuries. It has been some 500 years of hell. Were they jealous of the lives lived by these people, aka the Powhatan had claimed? Were they driven mad by the irrational hatred and fear inculcated with the demented narrow-mindedness of repressive religious teaching? Or were they simply driven by the whips of greed? As human beings are complex creatures, every one of these descriptions may have been impetus for their response to being strangers in paradise. Upon first contact with these people, the Spaniards extolled them as exemplars of beauty, gentleness, and generosity. Before long, these beings of virtue and peace would be transformed into red devils, for the green toxin had permanently changed the game. Like the outsiders within the tribes of Europe, Jews, Muslims, Irish, and many others, they were beyond the pale of considerations. They would serve as slaves, minors, whores, or not be allowed to live at all. Paradise Lost. It is both painful and difficult to recite the horrific happenings to the indigenous peoples of the Americas at the hands of the invaders. Yet, this is a story that must be told and retold, if only to wash away the sweet lies that Americans tell themselves and then brutally instill in their children. There is virtually nothing that the Europeans didn't do to those they held in thrall. They killed with fury that would have made the Nazis blush. They enslaved, they slew, they massacred, they raped, they burned, they starved, and they broke the Indians on the wheels of hatred like old glass. They killed and killed some more. They made the good old American saying, the only good Indian, into a motto that lives in the American soul. A motto of internalized massacre. They made these people pray to their sleeping drug gods for the blessing of death. Indeed, the gold-lusting invaders were so dazzled by their success, they spoke openly of monstrous exploits and correspondence to their homes and colleagues, words not necessarily intended for posterity. And even so, what was there to worry? Those who would read these words centuries hence would be descendants, their progeny and such. They would be the benefactors of their crimes and massacres. How could they protest if they would inherit the riches and ill-gotten wealth of this luxurious new earth? When the Portuguese governor of Brazil arrived on its well-watered coast, so great was the indigenous population that he declared it virtually inexhaustible. But more important is how he framed this idea in the turn of a phrase that can only be called savagely interesting. It would be impossible to have a lack of these people, he says, and supposes he's thinking of slaves. Even we were to cut them up in slaughterhouses. What a thought! And this is not a Portuguese peculiarity. The great chronicler Bartolomé de las Casas, the Christian missionary, played the role of spot reporter in his coverage of how fellow Spaniards treated those they met upon arrival in the Indies and the island of Hispaniola. Once the Indians were in the woods, fleeing the violence and oppression of the Spanish. The next step was to form squadrons and pursue them. And whenever the Spaniards found them, they pitilessly slaughtered everyone like sheep in a corral. It was a general rule among the Spaniards to be cruel, but extraordinarily cruel, so that harsh and bitter treatment would prevent Indians from daring to think of themselves as human beings or having a minute to think at all. So they would cut the Indian's hand and leave them dangling by a shred of skin and would send him on saying, "Go now, spread the news to your chiefs." They would test their swords and their manly strength on captured Indians and place bets on the slicing off of heads or the cutting of bodies in half with one blow. They burned and hanged captured chiefs. They spared no one. Babies, the ages, the pregnant, the sick. And they did this to send a message, a short and effective commercial. What was it but terrorism? If it was terrorism of a kind the world rarely sees, if ever. This is not to say that the world was without experience of great terror, for Europe for centuries suffered attacks on cities and cathedrals from the ravages of the berserkers known as the Vikings. They slew and ravaged and destroyed with a kind of sadism that was remarkable for its ferocity. But they rarely settled, for their objects were riches. They struck, they plagued, and before long they were gone. When the Europeans came to America, they remained. Original peoples were pushed out of existence. They sought to get the maximum exertions out of them in the South or in the maximum space away from them in the North. In any event, the central objective was to take all that could be taken, whether slaves, land, gold, silver, or jewels, whatever. The people were superfluous, for was not the supply inexhaustible? Standard, again citing the reports of Las Casas, describes a world so rife with murder that numbers were not necessary. What was important was gold, and the slaves to mine the gold, like parasites feeding on the remains of whatever was left alive once the winds of epidemic fever had passed over the native populations they encountered. The Spanish adventurers invaded, conquered, enslaved the peoples living in the rest of Mexico and in what today is Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. No one knows how many they killed or how many died of imported disease before the conquistadors arrived, but Las Casas wrote to Pedro de Alvarado and his troops by themselves, advanced killing, ravaging, burning, robbing and destroying all the country wherever he came. In all, he said, by other massacres and murders, beside the above, they have destroyed and devastated a kingdom more than 100 leagues square, one of the happiest in the way of fertility and population in the world. This same tyrant, Alvarado, wrote that it was more populous than the kingdom of Mexico. And he told the truth. He and his brothers, together with others, have killed more than 4 or 5 million people, 15 or 16 years, from the year 1525 until 1540. And they continue to kill and destroy those who were left. And so it will kill the remainder. If such estimates are stable over time, Las Casas described an area of 300 square miles as a league is equal to 3 miles in area on land. It might be enough to say that they slew Indians without mercy or care, but that could never be the entire story, for there was a method to their madness. The invaders sought gold, and so many Indians were assigned to white lords to serve as human tools of labor and gain. Under Columbus' authorized system of encomiendas, the indigenous peoples were allotted Spanish masters who could work them, exploit them, or abuse them, as was their pleasure. In too many cases to count, they simply worked them to death. a modern-day historian wrote or has written, some of the Indians, even as late as 1580s, were being broken physically. Their insides literally bursting from some instances from the heavy loads they had to carry, unable to endure more. Some of them committing suicide, hanging themselves, starving themselves, or eating poisonous herbs. They were forced to work in open fields where they tried to care for their children. They slept outside and gave birth to and reared their babies, who were often bitten by poisonous insects. Mothers occasionally killed their offspring at birth to spare them future agonies. Other working mothers present a poignant image when we hear of them returning home after weeks or months of separation from their children, only to find that they had died or been taken away. Invader pressures and oppressions such as these led to precipitous population declines across the vast areas of the region. Standard estimates that the Central Mexican population dropped from more than 25 million upon Spanish arrival to less than 1.3 million only 75 years later. In almost every country they reached, the populations declined by at least 90% pre-1492 levels, and some considerably more than that. In the tens of thousands of years of their long and varied existence, never had a scourge like this blighted their lives and populated their living nightmares. For many, death was a blessing, and for some, acquiescing in the horrors of slavery or soul death was preferable to a continuation of terror visited upon them by the Christians. We get some sense of how the Aboriginal peoples saw these Christians through the voice of a Kaki named Hatue, who in the final bid for freedom away from the Spanish monsters took his people and fled to Cuba. Once there in a place called Punau Maisa, he assembled his fellow clansmen and explained to them that the whites were crazed for gold. He bade his people to throw all of their gold trinkets into the river nearby so as not to attract the greed of the invaders. But it mattered not, for the Spanish followed them, and when they found them, they slew most of them, enslaving the rest. And as for Hatue, he was condemned to death by burning at the stake. His final moments as he was being tied to the stake, a Franciscan friar offered to convert him so that his soul might ascend to heaven with Jesus. And Hatui replied that if heaven was abode of the Christians, he preferred hell. For millions of people who we insist on calling Indians, Christ was a marker for disease, torture, pestilence, devastation, and massacre. There's little wonder that few would choose to adopt such an option, not freely anyway. But most of this horror came in the name of the mysterious Christ, this God of death. Some priests blessed the devastations carried on in the name of Christ, for they saw the hand of God in this continental extinction of the new world of unbelievers. Moreover, didn't the church condone and bless this savagery? Didn't the church and its highnesses at home profit from this unparalleled transfer of indigenous wealth to their coffers? The indigenous southern continental region certainly had reasons for a major beef, to be sure. But one could hardly limit it to that region. Many miles northward would find different ethnic groups, linguistic groupings and clans and tribes, but with similar experiences of world-threatening invaders. Similarly, they nurtured those who would later strangle their peoples, steal their lands, and grind their lives to dust. Standard's account of the attack on the Pequot village by the Connecticut militia is an example of how the English, under Commander John Mason, brought war to this host and neighbors. The British swarmed into the Indian encampment, slashing and shooting at anything that moved. Caught off guard, and apparently few warriors in the village, some of the Pequots fled. Others crept under their beds, while others fought back most courageously. But this only drove Mason and his men to greater heights of fury. "We must burn them," Mason later recalled himself shouting, whereupon he brought out a firebrand, putting it into the mats with which they were covered, and set the wigwams on fire. At this, Mason says, the Indians ran as men most dreadfully amazed. And indeed, such a dreadful terror did the Almighty let fall upon their spirits, that they would fly from us, run into the flames, where many of them perished. God was above them, who laughed his enemies and enemies of the people to scorn, making him as a fiery oven. Thus the stout-hearted spoiled, having slept their last sleep, none of the men could find their hands. Thus the Lord judged among the heathen, filling the place with dead bodies. The British governor, William Bradford, reacted to the massacre with typical English delight. It was a fearful sight to see them frying in the fire, and the streams of blood quenching the same, the horrible stink and scent thereof. But the victory seems a sweet sacrifice. They gave praise thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them, thus to enclose their enemies in their hands, and give them so speedy a victory over so proud and insulting an enemy. If we are to take the governor's report seriously, then we can only assume that the pride and insult of the Pequot War, perhaps massacre would be more honest, was prosecuted on a false claim, based on a pretext rather than on a casus belli. In that respect, the trait continues to resonate with American statecraft and warfare. As for the Pequots, their days are numbered. Few escaped the slaughters of their English the tormentors. Those that did survive, in chains in the West Indies, where they were shipped as a consequence of their survival, banished from their fathers, and were sent to dwell among the African captives in the slavery factories of the Bahamas and Jamaica. The real tragedy is that they were living, could be called the lucky ones. Indeed, the relative ease with which the English drove ancient peoples of New England helped drive the passionate push towards that grew in lockstep with the growth of the colonies and therefore the United States itself. The English way or the Spanish way was a quibble of methodology. All of the invaders of Turtle Island sought to extinguish the original peoples and exploit them when seen as profitable. This was but one page of the American Holocaust, which may aptly be termed as the American Genocide. For by whatever method could devise, by craft, by stealth, by misdirection, or legalized lies, the objective was to take the lands of the Redskins, and that they did. Enter the Africans. Most of us think that Christopher Columbus was an explorer, captain, and admiral of the trek to the Americas. But few know that he had an earlier career as a kidnapper and slave trader. The first-hand expertise gave him a leg up on the exploration gamble, as he decided to kidnap Indians for shipment to Spain, to show off his exotic treasures to the royal court and trade investors. One of his lessons from this infernal enterprise was when he kidnaps a man, also kidnap a woman, for this would have a calming effect on the male captive. At the time of the American explorations, Southern Europe was awash in slaves, but these people were, more often than not, prisoners of war, and included such various tribes as Turks, Bulgarians, Tatars, Armenians, and Africans. A brisk business developed on the Mediterranean. Many of these peoples were Africans described as Moors, captured in wars, who began to swell the burgeoning slave economy. For Muslims and Jews dwelling in post-1492, slavery often befell them or their children, for they were non-believers, and as such, subject to pains of captivity. Most of the Muslims were Moors, Africans, and were subject not just to slavery, but deportation abroad. The vast majority of people who were put in chains aboard slave ships, transported to the Indies or Brazil, and forced to build the infrastructure of the societies that would one day blossom forth. Shackleton would turn to be floating tombs. Some 30% of the human cargo didn't survive the trip from the Mediterranean to the Americas. By 1502, historians Francis Berry and John Blassingame, the slave trade had become a business that swelled into a boom. The first Americans arrived in the New World in 1502. By the time the slave trade ended in 1860s, more than 100 million blacks had either been killed or transplanted from their homeland. Although statistics on the trade are imprecise, it appears that 400,000 to 1 million of the 10 to 50 million Africans forcibly transplanted to the Americas came to North America between 1619 and 1808. Eventually, the raids of such groups as the Ashanti and Dahomey was so disrupted and depopulated West African states that the rulers began to protest against the trade. In the 16th century, for example, the king of the Congo, Nzinga Maremba, sent word to the Portuguese, "It is our will that the kingdoms of the Congo, that there should not be any trade in slaves, nor any markets for slaves." African rulers, unfortunately, were powerless to stop the trade. We must occasionally stop, if only to marvel at the sheer scope of these enterprises. Hundreds of millions of people pushed into the living death of slavery. Indians, then Africans, utilized as things, chattel, to enrich others and to build the lives of others, while denied the most fundamental attributes of life itself. It teaches us that the world we behold today was built on the bondage and bones, mega torture, death, devastation, Holocaust. No, chapter 10. We dedicate these ongoing unfolding chapter at the end of book 1, 2, and 3 to the courageous men and women who have defied civil disobedience, to battle the forces of empire head on, unconditionally, without regard for personal wealth, safety, or legacy. These individuals have looked the monster straight in the eye and said, "No, not this time." Our collection of defiant ones profile at the end of each book, personal heroes of your authors, is not meant to be comprehensive, but representative of those uncompromising insurgents who have inspired us both. These are the exemplars that remain emblazoned in our psyche as audacious examples of valor, gallantry, heroism, and guts. And none of those brave individuals wore uniforms. Instead of protecting the ruling class using tools and mechanisms of imperial power, money, guns, and violence, these empire busters use words, ideas, civil disobedience, and courageous action to fight back the beast. The Zapatistas explain it best. Our words are weapons. Howard Zinn echoes his spirit. On the other side are the formidable forces, money, political power, major media. On our side are the people of the world and a power greater than money or weapons, the truth. Cynics will frame these individuals and others like them as a collection of Don Quixotes on a noble but futile quest. Ultimately, these detractors, these misanthropists, these guardians of the status quo will frame and marginalize our freedom fighters as laughable characters, harebrained in their fight for peace and justice. They will ridicule their efforts and attack their character, painting images of, at best, hopeless romantics, or at worst, outlandish buffoons. These practical critics will further define the actions of those on this list as a vacant idealism bordering on insanity, and the nobility of their actions as utter folly. And if these demonizing efforts fail, the power and system in place historically and right now will charge them as miscreant rebels with criminal activities, and then finally with treason. Obedience to the gospel of the ruling class is how they render these dreamers as weak, impotent, and useless. In a letter, of course not something he could ever weave into public speak, President John Kennedy wrote this telling line: "War will exist until the distant day when the conscientious objector enjoys the same reputation and prestige as the warrior does." When Miguel de Cervantes wrote El ingenioso hidalgo de Quixote de la Mancha, the ingenious gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha, in the early 17th century, his work was viewed as a comedy, as a farce. But following the French Revolution, the novel grew in popularity to its essential theme that if individuals can be right while the whole of society can be absolutely dead wrong. Returning to the Howard Zinn, he frames the old manipulation this way: civil disobedience is not our problem. Our problem is civil obedience. Our problem is that people all over the world have obeyed the dictates of leaders, and millions have been killed because of this obedience. Our problem is that people are obedient all over the world in the face of poverty and starvation and stupidity and war and cruelty. Our problem is that people are obedient while the jails are full of petty thieves and the grand thieves are running the country. That's our problem, end of quote. The essence of civil disobedience is the ability to live authentically in the face of injustice. And the first word spoken, whether engaging the murder machine, the economic rapist, the race and fearmongers, or the misogynists who cling to the systematic nature and destructive bias of patriotic society, must always be no. Dick Gregory describes the importance of the word no. If you look at the story of Jesus Christ, the one thing that keeps coming up was the word no. I mean, they said, "Look, man, we don't want to kill you." The big man came in and said, "The Jews are crazy. We don't want to kill you, but just say that you're not the son of the Father." Jesus said no. He didn't get into any high-fiving or rapping. He just said no. Let me see. Can you just say, Christ says no, okay? No. No, God killed him. So, on the 2nd November 1965, Norman Morrison, a Baltimore Quaker, doused himself with kerosene outside Robert McNamara's Pentagon office and set himself on fire. He was saying no. When Mary Harris Mother Jones, dubbed in 1902 the most dangerous woman in America for her numerous successes organizing mine workers against mine owners, who then led a children's march from Philadelphia to New York, to the New York home of Theodore Roosevelt to protest the lax enforcement of child labor laws, she was saying no. In the early mornings of 28 June 1969, on Christopher Street in Lower Manhattan, when a popular gay bar called the Stonewall Inn, the customers en masse finally screamed no to the constant and illegal harassment by the Neanderthal New York City Police Department, and in a flash ushered in the modern LGBT movement, more recently expanded to the LGBTQIA, a challenge to the status quo nervous desire to keep things in neat, clean dichotomies, if ever there is one. In 1970, at the Berkeley Community Theater, during the height of the Vietnam War, a genius from Seattle screeched the hollowing notes that accompany the rocket's red glare. The bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there, at which Hendrix interjected whilst wearing his iconic Star Spangled Banner. The flag was still there, big deal. It was Jimmy's way of saying no. Nat Turner said it. Chief Joseph said it. John Brown said it. Emma Goldman said it. Andrea Dworkin said it. Dalton Trumbo said it. Asada Shakur said it. Harvey Milk said it. Cesar Chavez and Dolores Havate said it. Tecumseh and Sidney Bell Bull said it. Celia Sanchez said it. Ruben Salazar said it. Gil Scott Heron and Selma James said it. Arundhati Royce and Gary Webb said it. Bernadette Dorn said it. Muhammad Ali and Vito Rosie said it. Fred Hampton, Public Enemy, Mario Savio said it. Allen Ginsberg and Lawrence Ferlinghetti said it. Sacco and Vanzetti said it. Daniel and Philip Berrigan said it. So did Truth, Sojourner Truth, as did Ellsberg, Manning, Greenwald, Snowden, and the entire Occupy Wall Street movement, and as well as all of those unsung and unsung warriors, those pugilists who stood toe-to-toe with Goliath and said, not now, not ever, no, as did these remarkable mutinies. We all say no. Mumia Abu-Jamal.
Okay. Thank you, Summers. We're approaching the end of our program now. Before we finish, I'd like to point out that you can donate if you like. You don't have to, of course, but since the beginning of Corona, donations to support the struggle to free Mumia have been very rare. Now on the screen you will see the bank details for if you want to donate. I'd like to thank all those who made this event possible. First, of course, Darnell Stephen Summers, who prepared the reading of Murder Incorporated and has dedicated his whole life to freedom, justice, and peace. I want to thank the bookshop Schwarze Risse for organizing this event, and also the Netzwerk Förderverein who supported us with regard to some costs of this evening. I want to thank Berlin Mehringhof, who allowed us to produce in their facilities. And I want especially to thank our German translators who volunteered to translate for more than 1.5 hours so that people on the web and listeners on the radio can follow this event in German too. Thank you very much. Big thanks to Free Radio Berlin-Brandenburg for broadcasting this event and for keeping Mumia's commentaries in his case on their airwaves for so many years now. Of course, a big thank you to our wonderful technicians who make this event possible, for the video streaming, for the sound. Thank you very, very much. Without you, none of this would be happening. I'd like to thank everyone with Free Mumia Berlin, and of course the many groups and individuals who have helped to publicize this event throughout Berlin and the internet. You know who you are. On behalf of Free Mumia Berlin, I would like to express our gratitude for your support in the struggle to free Mumia for so many years by now. We really appreciate that. I would also like to thank Prison Radio in the US. They are a lifeline to prisoners and have published and supported Mumia Abu-Jamal for decades. Check out Mumia's almost weekly podcast on Prison Radio. You can go to prisonradio.org. You can click on journalists, and then you'll find the name of Mumia Abu-Jamal. You click on that. And I believe we've got a snapshot of this webpage on the screen now, don't we? Okay, Prison Radio, of course, is the publisher of all these 3 volumes of Murder Incorporated by Mumia Abu-Jamal and Stephen Vittoria. If you want to order all 3 in a box or any single volume, you can visit their website which is prisonradio.org, and you will find, just a minute ago I looked, on the right-hand side you will find advertisements for the books, and you can click on there and go through and order them. Please be patient. Due to Corona, mail deliveries can take more time than usual, especially if you order from outside the United States. I've been following part of this program, also looked at the comment sections in German and English, and I've seen that our wonderful Michael Schiffman has answered every question so far, so I know there are no more questions to be discussed here in this program. And therefore, I want to take the opportunity, before we close, to remind you of Mumia's pending appeals process. We have heard that a decision is imminent on when proceedings in this case will resume. We will do our best here from Berlin to report on the court proceedings and on the solidarity movement in the US for Mumia as soon as there are any news. The proceedings will decide whether, after almost 4 decades, the worldwide movement to free Mumia succeeds and Mumia Abu-Jamal can at long last go home. To follow updates or participate in the struggle to free Mumia Abu-Jamal, you can keep an eye on 2 websites we recommend. I mean, there are plenty of good websites. Just for the time of it, we will mention only 2. The first one is the US website from the Mobilization for Mumia. I believe we've got that on the screen right now. Do we have that on the screen? Not yet? Okay, there are 2 websites. One is from the Mobilization for Mumia, and the other one is from German Network to Free Mumia Abu-Jamal. If you could give me a sign once it's on the screen so I can carry on. Oh. Okay, we will post these websites and all the other information I just talked about underneath the YouTube recording. So everyone who wants to get these addresses, just have a look in maybe half an hour or tomorrow, and you will be able to see it all there. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll finish in a minute. I just mentioned it. These video recordings will be on the YouTube channel of Anton Mestin, so you can leave your comments there in the comment section. You can, of course, share the video then, the recording of the stream, with your friends, family, comrades, companions. Share it far and wide. From me, it's goodbye, and I want to close with Free Mumia, freedom all. Thank you very much.